Howdy, folks. Welcome. I don't know. Can you hear me? Hopefully, you can hear me. Okay. You can't hear me because I have my phone plugged in too. So, thank you. Welcome for the third installment of our winter off-season workshops. Super excited. This one I'm really excited about. This workshop is called Hosting and Planning Inclusive Rides. And I think about this a lot. And yeah, I think this is a really good primer for kind of the introduction to this subject. This is really geared towards, folks that are, that have their own riding groups or riding clubs or races or events. And it's also for folks that are just looking to, kind of diversify their scene or invite more folks in. So thank you so much for showing up for this presentation brought to you by Dirtbound. All right. So this channel is brought to you by Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. Super excited for the support. It makes all things that I do in the bike world possible. A little bit about Dirtbound. So Dirtbound is a para off-road cycling initiative that aims to empower, develop, and support para off-road cyclists. So who am I? I usually start off the presentation with this. My name is Annika Wade. I am your host. I am the founder of Dirtbound. I'm an adaptive athlete. I'm a full-time wheelchair user, and I ride a three-wheeled bike like the one in the picture. I ride mountain bikes and gravel bikes. I do have a road bike, but I don't get out that much on the road. And what do I do in the cycling space? Well, some people are like, are you a racer? Or how do you get into this space? Well, I categorize myself as being an advocate for BIPOC and individuals with disabilities. I think it's really important to show up and bring more people into the fold and bring more people into the scene and welcome folks that are already here with marginalized identities. And then what do I do outside of the cycling space? So I'm a geospatial professional. I work with satellites. So what is an inclusive ride, right? I think there's so many different ways we can think about this. The way that I like to think about it is you're going to have a diversity in participants, staff, and programming. And I really want to emphasize the staff and programming as well, because I think sometimes when we're thinking about, okay, how are we going to have inclusive events or inclusive races or rides, we often are thinking about it through the lens of just increasing participation, and we might have some metrics on what that looks like. But I also want to challenge you to think about how can we diversify, the leadership of our organizations, or how can we diversify, our types of programming, right? And what does that look like? So I think also there's a lot of different ways to think about inclusion, and we'll touch on this a little bit. It kind of just depends on like what you're thinking about for, what your lens is, what demographics are you trying to include. And so I don't want to pin down any one definition, right? But I do want to challenge you to think, is, inclusion this idea of, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or is it something more, right? And I always like to add like pluses to the end of these things, because in my world, I want to be as inclusive as possible and bring as many people into the fold, while also focusing on individuals and folks that have marginalized identities of all types. But that's just for my lens, right? Maybe your organization is looking to, increase participation in one particular area. So this is where we're heading to the next part. What's your goal, right? So let's say you are hosting a 50-person meet and greet at a gravel race, right? What's your goal here? How do you want to increase your inclusion, right? Or let's say, you run a weekly or monthly bike ride, right? What does it look like to be inclusive for that? So I ask you to kind of like define in a loose way, or it can be a really formal way, depending on the structure of what you're doing. What kind of diversity or what kind of inclusion are you trying to foster, right? Are you looking to foster, economic diversity? Maybe you're interested, as I am in a lot of instances, looking to welcome para and adaptive athletes into a particular space. Or maybe you're looking to have, gender inclusive events, or looking to increase gender diversity at your events. And taking a step back and really defining the goal is going to allow you to define the approach and really start to think about, well, how are we going to increase diversity? Because I'm thinking back to 2020, working with some women's mountain bike groups in Colorado. It's like, okay, well, we want to increase diversity. Well, what does that actually mean, right? Like, are we trying to find more folks that are Black and brown? Are we trying to find folks of a diverse skill background? Do you want economic diversity? And what we ended up finding out is like, we want all of it, right? And so that was like kind of our goal, is to just increase all of it under that Jedi perspective. So after you've defined that goal, think about, who do you want to invite and who is welcome? And this is so, so, so important. And this kind of goes off to that next planning phase, right? So you've kind of defined the goal for your organization. You defined the goal, and now you're going to think, well, who do we want to invite? And I invite you to think about this by the language that you use on your website, on your Instagram posts, on your flyers, whatever your method of communicating about your events. Maybe it's a meetup page, maybe it's a Telegram message, or a post on Threads or Blue Sky, whatever it is you're using. Be very explicit in your language around who is welcome. And I think there's a lot of ways to do this in a very, great manner, right? And I also encourage you to kind of review some of these invitations. Like, if you're new to this space, review some of these invitations and the language you're using with other members in your community and say, hey, like, how does this land, right? Like, I'm trying to invite these people. Does this invitation work? And it's a process, right? And you might not always get it right every single time, but be open to that feedback. So like, I have kind of a practice with some of my friends when we're rolling out new events or new posts. I'll just send a text to somebody and be like, hey, like, I'm trying to invite XYZ people. Does this post make any sense? Like, am I capturing the right slice of pie here? Or, they're forming the right pie, and folks are like, close. I would change this wording. I would do this. And especially too, if this is kind of a newer part, like I said, for your organization or your group to, invite new folks in, it's worth just taking a little bit of time to think about, how can you be explicit in your language, and then how to use language that that's inclusive and welcoming. I always put in my presentations, like, it starts with an invitation, and I think this is so important. Invitations go such a long way, and I mean, think about that time when you were invited to an event, and it doesn't have to be a cycling event, just any event, and you were invited, and maybe you were like unsure if you were welcome there, right? Like, could be a birthday party in fifth grade, it could be, some work event or something where you're like really unsure. And then somebody's like, hey, do you want to come to this? Like, we would love to have you there. And just think about how good that makes you feel, right? And when you are inviting people to your event or to your space, really take some time to reflect on that, right? The invitation is one of the most important parts of the event. It's almost sometimes more event than some of the other details, right? Like, did you invite folks? Do they feel welcome to show up in your space? Um, I also think about this too, reflecting on cycling, right? So, when I was first learning how to mountain bike as an able bodied mountain bike rider, I wasn't often invited to many rides. I rode by myself. I felt really isolated. And I remember when I joined my first like community of cyclists, how good it felt when folks invited me to stuff and they said, hey, like, we're going to this event. Does anybody want to come or do you want to come? And I just thought, wow, this is like a huge shift. Like I'm feeling like more empowered and that actually like increased my confidence in the sport, right? And it allowed me to get to where I am, right? Those invitations. So just really kind of reflect on that it's really important to invite people. Um, and after your event, after everything's said or done, or maybe even after the first round of invitations go out, think about, how you can reiterate to people that communities are welcome and post about the event. And think about ways to continue to reinforce that inclusion. One of the things I see is sometimes people, they'll have a scholarship. They'll be like, okay, we got this one scholarship for para athletes. Come one, come all. And it's one post and then you get to the event and nobody cares. There's no excitement around it. And so I encourage you to think about how do we continue that excitement throughout the span of the year and let people know this is a space, you are welcome here. We want you to show up. We're going to continue to celebrate you throughout the year. It's not just a marketing and PR thing. It's not just for this one picture. It's not just to check a box, but you really truly are welcome here. Now, if that's not your stance, then don't do that. But I think most of the people in this this webinar are here to be in this shared same space with us all. Okay, so we talked about, once again, you define your goal and how do you think about diversity and how do you think about being inclusive. I really want to encourage you too that start to plan what you're doing from that place of inclusion, right? I think a lot of times what we've noticed in the past is like these things are just an afterthought, right? Like, so I'm a full-time wheelchair user and I see buildings get put in and then I see a ramp built afterwards, right? Whereas new buildings, for instance, have accessibility built in from the get-go, right? They are planning to have a ramp. They're going to have an elevator. They're going to have the push buttons to enter a door. So start your planning process from that place of inclusion, and it becomes just so much easier. Now, this isn't always possible with legacy events, legacy rides, legacy groups. But what you can start to do is when you approach your programming kind of from a yearly basis or whatever it is that kicks that off for the next year or the next cycle, maybe take a step back and be like, all right, let's say we reimagine this process. Let's entangle it from its past and think about a new way of how we're going to plan with inclusion at the center of what we're doing. And part of this includes working with a diverse set of individuals, right? Bring in people into the community, bring in the folks that you're trying to invite to your group to be a part of the planning process, because in so many ways, no one expects anyone to be an expert at any of this. And no one person is an expert at any of this, right? So bring lots of voices into the room and bring lots of people in, and you're just going to find that events and planning and the whole thing is just going to be so rich if you do that. So like I mentioned, invite the communities that you're trying to serve into plan, right? You're not separate, you're a part of a community, right? And so getting that feedback loop going, bringing people in is really important. I also do want to mention too, when you're planning and you're bringing people into the communities, if you have the opportunity to, to pay people or compensate, that is always much appreciated. So that goes into this part. Consider working with a consultant. So let's say you own or operate a really large event, or you're looking to do something like that, or your organization has the funds to do this. Think about working with somebody that's a consultant. So, like for instance, in the para space, right? There's lots of different consultants you can hire to look at trails or to look at events or race guidelines. And these are individuals that are really ingrained in the community and can help streamline the process for you, right? They've got probably a little checklist, things they can, bring awareness to, like, hey, have you thought about accessible porta potties on course if it's a race? Or, hey, have you thought about making sure you're adding captions to your Instagram reels to be more accessible for the community? Or, hey, have you thought about doing XYZ? These are individuals that you can lean on to be your subject matter expertise as you're starting to learn or embrace this process, right? And then we talked about, once again, just making sure that inclusion is always part of the process. Prioritize it, right? It's not an afterthought, it is the thought. And then once again, with the communities, just invite people in that you're serving. So part of a big thing about hosting and planning inclusive rides is it's not as much sometimes about like the people that show up and what that looks like, right? It's really about understanding the needs of the community. Because let's say you are trying to host an event and people are like, that's not even like what we want or like where we want to be, right? Understand the needs of the community, right? There might be specific trail names or specific areas of interest that might not be friendly or okay for certain individuals to feel welcome in, right? And so that's where it's like, let's understand the needs of the community, right? And be open to learning. I think one of the biggest things about this journey is just really peeling back yourself and being vulnerable, right? And understanding you're not going to be an expert in this. Really, no one's an expert in this. And we are all going to be constantly learning, right? And looking at it not from a place like, oh God, there's so much I need to study. Like, I'm so far behind on this. Like, I'm just doing a bad job. But no, it's like, hey, look, this is just kind of a part of the human journey as we start to encounter more individuals, as we start to bring more people into our community, as we start to become more open. There might be some new things that we may need to learn, right? So just being open to that new information and being open to learning. Invest time in your organization to learning and gathering resources. If you have the means, like I said, hire a consultant or hire somebody that can provide the resources. Maybe you need to dedicate some time or a weekend or a workshop or something rather to kind of compile things to give to your staff, to say, hey, we're going to invest a little bit of time to learn and how this works. Everybody starts this journey from somewhere. So once again, just because I'm Black does not mean I know everything about Black people, does not mean I know everything about, inclusion or diversity and just because I'm a wheelchair user doesn't mean I know everything about disability or accessibility, right? I have to start my journey from somewhere and I still have a lot more to learn, right? And I don't think about it as like, oh, there's just so much I need to learn. It's just like, this is just part of the process. As I go through the world, I'm taking on more information, but I had to start this journey somewhere. So I want to give a quick story about Vita Mountain Biking Series, which was a group that existed in Colorado, like the Front Range of Colorado, that I became involved in. Around 2020, we decided to, a few of us, members of the group that were Black, Indigenous, and people of color decided to band together and start a little subgroup within it called the Impact Committee. And the Impact Committee was thinking about how are we going to increase representation within our group? What are we going to do to create a more welcoming environment? And so, we had to kind of define the goals. Okay, what does inclusion look like for us in this group? Who are we trying to attract more of? What do we need to do to attract more people? And so what we decided was, we were looking to increase, BIPOC membership and be more gender diverse as well. And so I was a part of the education committee, and what we did was we put together a little DEI guidebook. It was like, a little Google Doc that was a ever-changing kind of living, breathing document that kind of captured everything, right? Like we break down like exactly what JEDI is, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We talked a little bit about, pronouns. We talked a little bit about anti-ableism and then what ableism is. We talked about using inclusive language. We talked about, equity. So we kind of touched on these little points. We made it in a really digestible format for people to really take that information in. And before every single clinic for, the next year and a half, we would hold like, DEI kind of like happy hours, right? And this allowed people to show up on Zoom. These are, pandemic days, to show up on Zoom and ask questions in a very safe environment and be like, hey, like, I'm not sure like what this means. Like, can you walk me through how to use these pronouns? Or can you walk me through this scenario? I've never encountered this before, right? And the nice part about that too is it actually provided a good feedback loop. It's like, hey, is like this information useful? Like, are you using this out in the field? Like, what's the feedback? What do you need help with? And the nice part about that too is just creating an environment where in the community, we were setting ourselves up for success because we're not like holding all these things on a pedestal. We're bringing it down to kind of the people and being like, hey, like in this community, we give each other feedback and we are supportive. And if we see something, we're like willing to help you, right? It's not like, oh gosh, you got this wrong. Like you said that thing that was like really, really bad. And I know you're trying to learn and you're out, right? It was more of like, hey, like that was kind of interesting. Like, let's like talk about that and let's like find ways to maybe not say that or not do that in the future, or how can we provide a better experience, right? And it was all about providing a better experience for our participants, right? I do want to mention too, there are dollars that can be associated with becoming more inclusive. And I know people know this, but I know unfortunately, there's a lot of talk about this kind of stuff these days, but I really want to say you can make money by being more inclusive, right? The more people you bring into the event, the more money that's flowing in if your event is charging things. So just keep that in mind. That's not the primary reason that you should enact these things, right? I mean, if you want to, like, go for it, right? Like, I'm not going to stop you. And for a lot of us, that's not our what we're going for. But I do just want to mention that, like, there are ways that you can frame this to larger parts of your organization. Okay. This one is huge. Be open to feedback. I think this is the number one hardest thing about working in this space is the feedback, right? Because here you are, you've spent 9 months planning for your event, or 3 months planning for this this ride. And then somebody comes and they're like, that was not a good experience for me. And you're like, what? You're like, I studied all this stuff. Like, I used the right language. Like, what do you mean? Right. And so, first thing is like, ask your riders, ask your participants, ask your staff, ask your volunteers, ask the community members for feedback, right? And be very specific about that feedback. You can do this in like a post-event survey. You can, pull senior staff away, committee members away, and just be like, hey, let's talk about like, how do you think, we achieve this goal, or what do you think about this? And then being really open to listening and learning. And I think this is the hardest part, right? And so, I work for like a really super duper inclusive, or I'm on the board for a really super duper inclusive event and organization, but there are times where like we have not gotten it right and there's feedback, right? And so it's like even in the most inclusive or appearing or seemingly inclusive spaces, there are ways to miss the mark, right? And that's okay, right? It's about being open to feedback. It's about being open to change, and just really like take all of this always from kind of that like beginner's mindset, right? Like you're not always going to get it right or perfect the first time, and sometimes you're just going to miss the mark, right? As long as you're not like intentionally causing harm, it's just like, yeah, you got it wrong. Like, the other day somebody was like, it's funny, I posted a video and I forgot to put captions on my video. I almost always do captions and I honestly just like forgot to do it. And somebody was so kind as to be like, "Hey, can you add captions to your next video?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And I was like, "Oh man." I was like, "I'm so embarrassed. Like, I totally missed the mark here. Like, I should have done that." But it's like, you know what? Instead of like, I'm not gonna like argue with this person in my comments because that would be weird. I wouldn't do that anyway. But also it's just like just a simple like absolutely like I totally get you want to be inclusive, right? I think that's the best approach. And two, when you're receiving the feedback, like I said, like don't argue with people, don't question people about their experiences. Don't be like, well, what I heard was like there was this amenity for you, or I witnessed something different. Just be very open to what a person is telling you or writing to you. It takes a lot of courage for somebody to provide that feedback. And so provide a safe space and be respectful. And then after they've said something, you can go back in your own space in your own time and reflect on that and be like, oh, okay, here's what's going on. But you don't need to react in the moment about that and like start arguing or refuting a person, right? I think it's best to sometimes just be like, thank you for giving that feedback. I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. And then if you have a response, you have a response, or let me get back to you with a response because I want to make sure that I'm, giving this the respect that it needs or something. So my perspective as a para athlete is, at an event, these are the things that I'm looking for. So I'm looking for one, an invitation, right? I don't go to a lot of events or rides that I'm not sure I'm invited to. And whether that be because I'm Black, whether that be because I'm in a wheelchair and use adaptive equipment, I'm always looking for that invitation. I'm always looking at the Instagram page, seeing if I see anybody that looks like me or any indication that I'm welcome. I'm also looking as a para athlete for like things like accessible parking and venue. I'm looking for accessible trails and recreation activities. So let's say it's an enduro race. Okay, let me look at the trails. Let me watch videos. Let me see like how they're going to work for my bike. Or let's say it's a gravel race or gravel route. Is there like historically like a large section of mud that's going to be hard for me to pass? Or what does it look like on the trail? Is that going to work for my bike? And then I'm also looking for a contact email or person to help answer questions. So when you're building out your websites, when you're building out your Instagram posts, your pages, however it is that you're disseminating information, it's never a bad idea to like within reason, right? Like drop some contact information there. It's the internet. It's a little wild out there. So like use your discretion here. But if you have kind of like a catch-all organization email, it could, in this case, it could be like accessibility at event.com or whatever, or info@event.com. But have a place where you can capture some of those emails so people can answer questions. And with that too, like check your Instagram DMs because I don't know if you have a business account, but Instagram has like a really interesting way of like nesting messages. So like it could be in like your like hidden messages. It could be like in the folder below your hidden messages. But check those because oftentimes people do reach out for questions as well there. So here's a little inclusion checklist I like to think about. It's like, do you have an interpreter at your event? Is there access to accessible bathrooms, right? And for accessible bathrooms, if you're at a race or an event, will there be bathrooms like on the way, right? So thinking about like in the middle of the race, if it's like a longer course, like 50 miles, 30 miles, 70, whatever, do you have accessible restrooms there? If you also have accessible restrooms there, do you have ways for folks with mobility aids to get into the bathrooms? That's a whole other thing. Another thing to think about is what physical barriers exist within the event, right? So, are there gigantic hills at the expo? Are there literal walls that separate people, or gates that are too small, or sand that folks with prosthesis might have trouble walking on? So what kind of physical barriers exist within that event? Also, what's the space and location like, right? Like, is it a place, if it's like an in-town thing, is it a place that's close to like public transportation? Is that, maybe the demographic you're serving that's important? Does the event location have stairs? Does it have accessibility, portions built in? Or are you going to have to like amend this space, put mats in or ramps in or whatever it might be? Now talking kind of a little bit about economic inclusion, do you have a low cost option? Do you have sliding scales? Maybe your event is free, so maybe this isn't an issue for you. But thinking about ways to open up your event to more participants by lowering that financial barrier. Is the invitation and web page accessible, right? Like, super important. I've definitely missed the mark on this before. So make sure, once again, you could just ask your friends and just be like, hey, I'm gonna like screenshot this to you. Like, can you tell me if this works or not? And I think people are more than happy to help in this space. What kind of options do you have for food, drink, and water, right? Like, do you have water that doesn't have electrolytes, right? Maybe do you have electrolytes on the side? Do you have snacks? Are you going to be building snack time into your events, which you should always be building snack time into your events, by the way, but that's a personal preference. Thinking about, for your food, like, are you going to be accommodating a diverse set of dietary needs, right? What does that look like? Are you able to poll your participants beforehand? And then this is actually like one of the biggest ones, and we could have literally a whole workshop on this. Do you have a plan to maintain your safe spaces, right? So here you are. You're curating all these beautiful spaces. You've got everything. You've got the snacks. You've got all the right people. You've got, financial barriers lowered. And then some person comes into the space and mucks it all up, right? And now you've got an incident and you're like, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about that. And maybe it's not even a person that's associated with the event because, like, once again, people just show up from everywhere, right? And then you're like, crud, we got to deal with this. So what's your plan, right? And that's part of safe spaces, right? Like, you've got to build them. You've got to think about how you're going to curate them, but you need to maintain them. And so much of like how you respond is a part of that safe space. So do you have an incident system, right? Maybe somebody sees something and you tell your volunteers, if you see something, come report to X person will come out, and you could radio to them, they'll come out and handle the situation. Or maybe you're using a deflection method, or maybe you're using, XYZ, maybe you're using nonviolent communication. whatever the plan is, make sure you have that plan in advance. You don't want to have that plan when, the space is all mucked up. You want to have that kind of like in your muscle and in your system. But that part about planning to maintain safe space, like I said, that's a whole workshop that we can do. And I think if you're interested in looking at that, like definitely check out, like conflict resolution, nonviolent communication. There's ways you can like easily build out a plan for that, but that is super duper important. And then just as much as it is around, managing maybe the person, place, or thing that's mucked up the space, it's also about protecting the individuals that are there and that have been impacted as well. And remembering that, not everybody that's been impacted or harmed always feels comfortable to be in that space and just kind of disclose, more details. So, I will say right now that this was like one of our shorter workshops, and that's kind of by design because I don't want folks to get so like bogged down, right? I think it's really kind of about the high level things and about infusing inclusion into the center of your planning process, and then leaning on folks in your community to help build out those checklists, right? So let's say you're like, hey, we want to have more para folks. Great. You don't know anything about adaptive individuals. You don't know anything about adaptive racing or adaptive rides, whatever. That's great. You don't need to. Bring somebody in that does, bring them on the team, and there you go. You have started, that planning process from a place of inclusion. I know this isn't always, you're not always able to continue to grow your organization in that way and pay people, right? But thinking about ways to partner with individuals or partner with organizations so that you can achieve your goals. And it doesn't matter what you ride or how you ride. It just matters that you're outside and you're experiencing joy. So big thanks to SRAM. They are our supporter here at Dirtbound for this year. So excited to have the financial support this year. It just makes everything amazing. And then, big thank you to my individual sponsors and support that allow me to be here in this capacity. So at this point, I am going to pass it over to you all and ask if anybody has any questions or something that they want to talk about. Because we've got about, I don't know what time. Let's say we've got 10, 15 minutes to kind of chat about this and make this into a conversation. So if anybody has any questions, drop them in the comment box. Once again, thank you. And thank you so much for everyone showing up. I really appreciate it. I really do think that it's going to take all of us kind of working together and sharing knowledge and no gatekeeping, right? I know sometimes there's competition between events and spaces and places and rides, but I think it's so much richer when we all just share the information we have, because our end goal is the same, right? Like we just want to bring people in and create a wonderful environment. So thank you. And thank you, Grassroots Gravel, for showing up. Super excited on all the work you're doing. All right. Any other questions? I'm going to turn on the music so I'm not just like sitting here in silence. Well, it's not silence because I'm talking, but I'm going to stop talking for a second and I'll put on some music. Okay, so there was a question kind of about wheels to portalet on course. And yeah, this is a big one, right? So like let's say, and I think this is what you mean grassroots gravel. So let's say you are riding an adaptive, or let's say you are a para athlete and you need to be able to get from your cycling equipment to the bathroom or to the on course porta potties. What does that look like? And there's a suggestion within the community that maybe having like renting like a hospital wheelchair, or getting a hospital wheelchair and doing that, because then that allows even folks that have prosthesis, you know um you know to also be able to use it, and it could also be for wheelchair users. So it's not just for wheelchair users, but it's for anybody that might have challenges in kind of balance or walking long distance. So I think that that would be kind of an option. Thanks, Osborne, for showing up. I appreciate it. So yeah, maybe thinking about a way to get hospital wheelchairs, and going to the bathroom, having that there. And then maybe also training some individuals that are race volunteers at that aid station to be able to assist with individuals if they need help, right? Maybe somebody needs help, standing upright, or maybe somebody might need help transferring from their equipment, or maybe somebody needs help, balancing their equipment, whatever it might be. That could be a really good option. So I think that's kind of the big thing around that. um I think, yeah, like as you're starting to plan the details on things, like definitely the details for your event and race, yeah, think about all aspects of it, right? And so maybe a good exercise you could go through is like, okay, let's say I'm a person with a disability. What would it look like? Yeah, like you said, to go pick up my packet. What does it look like to go to the bathroom? Or let's say I want to go visit one of the activations or events. Or what does it look like after the ride if I want to get some shade, or if I want to get my post ride meal? So I think you can kind of put yourself into little different exercises and zoom into those and see like what does it look like to interact in that space. But that's super exciting that you're adding para this year. I know Colorado will be excited to have another event that's open to para athletes. So yeah. All right. Yeah, there's a lot of physical barriers. It's funny because now that I'm a wheelchair user, um, a lot of my friends have just started noticing things. So sometimes I'll occasionally get a text from somebody and they'll be like, I'm at this bar, or like I'm at this like movie theater and it's like not accessible, and I just yelled at the people that own it or something. I'm like, okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. But yeah, there's so many physical barriers, and you don't really see them until you're like in this space, or until you have like a close friend or family, or you're like thinking about it through this lens. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's been a process for me too, becoming disabled, like going through the process of like noticing the physical barriers and being like, wow, like sometimes there's a lot. Like I'll drive through some cities and I'll just be like, wow, like I can't get into like any of these houses. So it's kind of a bummer, but yeah. All right, we got about 5 more minutes. I hope your Zwift ride is going well, Lauren. great. Well, thank you so much for showing up. I appreciate it. Woo. I think one of the best parts about, and the reason why I wanted to do this as a YouTube series is because now the content just lives in perpetuity online. It's not that I like don't want to continue to like do these workshops, but I think there's like a lot of value in just having this information free. I mean, like that's the key. I'm not trying to like do any of this. It's just like, no, I'll do it. This is actually one that this workshop is one I built out, I don't know, maybe like 2 years ago or so. So, still obviously very, very relevant. Cool. We got 2 minutes left. One-minute countdown. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It has been an absolute pleasure. Really excited to continue to connect with you all. So if you're not following Dirtbound or me on Instagram, please do so. Let's stay in touch. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your night and good rest of your week. All right. Bye, folks.